what about easy, right? We talked about price. Remember that diagram we had before where it said, you know, it has to be cheap, but it also has to be easy. So is 3D modeling easy? Well, this is a cool little set of photos, actually. Okay, so what's in this photo is our product managers, basically the people who design Google SketchUp, sitting in a room in our headquarters in Mountain View, California, watching a user that we've brought in test our software. So we're trying to see how usable the software actually is. And we've been watching for about an hour at this point. After about an hour, the user, totally uncoached by us, found the orbit tool. Now the orbit tool is the core of SketchUp. This is how you move something around in three-dimensional space. Should it take an hour for somebody to find this functionality?
Yeah, and I think, you know, this points out one of the most difficult things about 3D modeling, and that is the whole notion of the abstract space of 3D. So this is a diagram that was done by my friend Steve Oles, who's an architectural illustrator that many of you might know, and he was trying to talk about this basic problem that if you look at this person standing there with their pen, there's a kind of two-dimensional image space, which is where they're actually working, a flat surface like a screen or a piece of paper. And in their mind, there's this abstract representation behind that surface, which is the model. And then there's an even more complex thing, which is really just kind of existing in the mind of the person who's doing the modeling, which is the full-featured, what he would call the four-dimensional version of the model.
And people who can draw, you know, this is just natural. You just do this in your head, right? But it's a skill that you develop usually as a kid, and you continue to develop it as you draw and represent three-dimensional space in two-dimensional form throughout your life.
Right, and we actually wonder now if the fact that this is seen as a specialized set of skills isn't some kind of limiter on the number of people that can do 3D modeling. So let's look at some other limiters.
So this is a diagram that kind of implies a general population of people. So let's imagine, and actually the diagram's a little bit abstract, so let's make it a little bit more concrete. Imagine you've got one person at the top, 10 people in the middle, and 100 people down at the bottom. In this case, that little person on top happens to be John. We flipped a coin. That top person is essentially
I always wanted to be the top person.
A creator. Well, in many people's minds you are. Your mom.
My mom.
That's about it. John's a creator. He's the person who's out there actually designing stuff. So you can imagine that there's designers. There are makers, people who maybe use other people's designs but still make stuff. And you've got the general population of consumers. And so what that diagram we were trying to show basically says is that for every, let's say, very few creators you have a few more makers, people making stuff, but you've got a huge general population of people who aren't basically making anything at all. They're just consuming the things that other people make. The specific example here would be perhaps a creator is a person who designs patterns for dressmaking. The makers would be the people who use the pattern and actually make a dress, and the consumers would be people who just go out and buy a dress.
Okay, so we think 3D modeling is working pretty well for this small population of creators. And it's not just SketchUp. I mean, the whole range of 3D modeling programs that you can think of are really designed to service this group of people.
It's also working really well for the makers, right? It's working really well, and this is actually something we're really proud of with SketchUp, is it's not just the high-end pro people who are designing machine parts and running shoes and jet engines and stuff like that. This is people who are out there designing their backyard deck, designing some chairs for their living room. They're trying to figure out how to configure stuff. This is hobbyists, maybe, but specific hobbyists.
But that leaves an open question, right? The big market, the massive number of people that you really want to reach, why do they need 3D modeling? They may not really understand 3D. They just want to consume things. So what can we do to reach them?
Let's change this diagram out a little bit, right? We saw this hard to easy, expensive to cheap diagram. What if we change that horizontal axis and make that boring to exciting? So we would argue that the things that get people to adopt technology aren't just whether they're easy and cheap. They also have to be worth doing, right? Just because it's easy and cheap doesn't mean you want to do it. So let's look at some different activities that people do on these axes. Theoretical physics, while exciting to some people, I would argue, is usually boring and hard to the general population. Therefore, not much of the general population does theoretical physics. Remember how many people put up your hands before? Yeah, look around. Digital photography is something that is easy, exciting, and actually cheap at this point, right? Everybody's phone can do it. And so we'd position it there on the axis. So the question is, where is 3D modeling? We're going to say it's right there.
So 3D modeling, we know that it's still kind of hard. You know, the abstractions are still hard for people to get. The tools are getting easier and easier, and I think that, you know, from SketchUp's perspective, we're trying to push as hard as we can to make them even easier, and are probably a little bit exciting at this point.
Yeah. The idea is that people can make 3D models, and they get excited about making 3D models, but they're not an end product, right? When you're done making a 3D model, what you have is a 3D model, and you can't even really frame that, put it on your desk. So the question is, what's going to make 3D modeling easy and exciting? 3D in 3D. And this is an important thing. Let's a little illustration here.
Okay, so we've already talked about the abstraction of 3D. And here, of course, is a great engraving by Albert Dürer talking about perspective. You can see the picture plane, you can see the physical object, and we've got a very clear representation of what 3D is and how to make it.
Yeah, okay, stop right there. I think we can all agree, this kind of explanation, hard. What's not hard? Oh, a 3D model. Here's John, our very favorite model, holding a model. And I would argue that the one on the right is more useful most of the time.
Nice.
This is a model of a building that was 3D printed. The cool thing is you don't have to master an orbit tool. There's no rotate tool, no zoom tool. It's all built into his hand, right? Want to look at the other side? Just turn your hand around. 3D printing is the key to 3D modeling becoming a reality for the general population. Right. It's the apotheosis of 3D.
Yeah, I mean, we've been, as human beings, learning how to deal with 3D in this way for, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of years. You know, we've been sort of engaged in this. It makes sense to everybody. You can hand a model like this to somebody who doesn't know how to draw or doesn't want to talk about perspective or picture planes or any of those things, and they get it.
They get it because it's easy. So the conclusion we have is,
making stuff is awesome.
Making 3D models maybe not so awesome, but making stuff from your 3D models, that's awesome.
Well, making 3D models also awesome.